So, and here we are with the second day of a panel discussion, European Fundamental Values and Digitalization. It's a part of a big, interesting, I hope, project, European Fundamental Values in Digital Era. It's a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and that's a project which is implemented in Yaroslav Mudry National Law University and funded by European Union. Now I will switch to Ukrainian for a couple of minutes to present this project, because yesterday I described it in English, and today I will speak a bit in Ukrainian instead. Тож, проєкт «Європейські фундаментальні цінності у цифрову еру» – це Erasmus-проєкт. Ми з вами разом з 2022 до 2025 року. І це проєкт, який присвячено тому, яким чином фундаментальні цінності впливають на правові системи, і яким чином вони імплементуються в цих системах. І фокус тут саме на європейських фундаментальних цінностях і на тому, як ми в Україні їх адаптуємо. Ми маємо освітню, дослідницьку і policy-making частину, в рамках якої підготовлено деякі рекомендації для різних стейкхолдерів. І дуже коротко я скажу, що ми щасливі представити свіжий доробок. Це монографія «Європейські фундаментальні цінності у цифрову еру». Я поширю її на буквально хвилину на скріні. Вона є у відкритому доступі, ми зараз в чат відправимо посилання, тож ви зможете завантажити цю книгу, ми будемо дуже раді будь-якому фідбеку, звичайно. І тут є також 3 смислові частини. Як бачите, дещо є українською і дещо англійською. Це є частина, присвячена концепції європейських фундаментальних цінностей у цифрову еру, правам, принципам, даним. Є частина, яка присвячена імплементації європейських фундаментальних цінностей у договірному та деліктному праві. І є частина, яка присвячена процесуальним аспектам імплементації фундаментальних європейських цінностей у цифрову еру. Пані Наталя, чи хочете щось теж прокоментувати трохи?
Так, доброго дня, шановні колеги. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We are really glad to see you all here. I will now switch back to Ukrainian. Таким чином, дійсно, у нас є ось такий чудовий проєкт, який називається «Європейські фундаментальні цінності в цифрову еру», і вже є його такий результат, яким ми насправді пишаємося. Це ось ця монографія, ми про неї зазначали вже, я не буду довго про неї розповідати, я лише надішлю зараз у чат в загальний доступ всім посилання на цю монографію, і всі ви можете з нею ознайомитися за цим посиланням. Вона переважно складена англійською мовою, але всі автори намагалися писати якомога простішою і зрозумілішою англійською мовою, щоб дійсно це, знаєте, як достукалося до кожного читача, і читачам не було ніяких складнощів із сприйняттям насправді доволі непростих матерій, оскільки ми, власне кажучи, намагались осягнути і таку максимально, я б сказала, загальну філософську категорію як цінності з одного боку, і з іншого боку не менш складну категорію, якою є цифрова ера. Тим не менше, повторюся, намагалися писати максимально просто. Дякую всім, хто до нас долучився. Ну і, власне кажучи, передаю слово назад до Юлії. Пані Юлія.
Thank you, dear Natalia. Then we jump into English again. So now we have time for our presentations, and I'm happy to introduce a colleague of mine, Johan Edebo, for the first presentation. Johan is philosopher of religion, and his research involves some metaphysics, the nature of consciousness, philosophy of science, epistemology in general, and some issues of religion and politics. He is also part of two projects related to AI issues. That's Wallenberg Autonomous Systems, WASP HC network, and there is a project, Artificial Intelligence, Democracy and Human Dignity. He involves, and me too. And there is a project, the Artificial Public Servant. Johan is now in Japan, because he is a visiting researcher at the Center for Global Studies. So today he will speak about the impact of AI and late digitalization on the epistemic foundations of science and academic research. Dear Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julia. That is quite a mouthful, I think, but that's the intended topic for today. So I'm a philosopher. I've been doing research in philosophy of science and philosophy of technology. In the last 5 years, I've been involved in research on the societal effects of artificial intelligence, not least with my colleague, Dr. Julia Resmeteva here. And I'm currently a visiting researcher at a place called the Seijo University in a city outside of Tokyo called Setagaya. Let me just try to share the screen with you and see where we end up. So, do you see this?
Yes.
Excellent. Today, I just want to talk about some risks and problems that are related to the rollout of artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to the integrity of scientific and academic research and also knowledge production in general, I think. And if we look at the major policymaking institutions, it seems like the dominant perspective seems to be that the implementation or the introduction of AI or AI-related tools into research, into scientific research, is this unqualified and self-evident good for the world's research communities. And of course, these technologies promise many potential gains, but these gains are relatively easy to see, and I think the gains are amplified by the marketing and the PR efforts that support the AI rollout, while the potential downsides of any technology can be difficult to see before the actual results emerge and are made manifest. And in this situation, I see a context where a significant portion of the major grant-making organizations, policy institutions, they strongly emphasize the importance of accelerating the uptake of AI in science so that the uptake can move as fast as possible. And while these organizations generally seem to be aware of the risks involved, the emphasis on a rapid rollout seems to potentially exacerbate and make worse many of the risks inherent to the technology. And I see a special threat in relation to AI's impact on methodology and epistemic effects on with the way evidence is produced and these sorts of things. We'll get into them in detail, I hope. So my intention today is to give you an overview of some of these risks, and maybe in the discussion, perhaps add some observations around how we maybe can mitigate and get around these risks. And to begin with, I want to establish a premise for the discussion, and that is my contention that science as we know it is something sensitive. It's a complex of traditions of knowledge and interlocking institutions for knowledge production. And I will just claim here that science has a certain richness of content, of methods, and of practices that we cannot really reduce to a narrow set of rules and procedures. So science is not just an easily defined method that we apply to empirical reality. It's something more complex and something more historically situated and localized than this abstract method. So science holds a good number of unspoken or tacit implications in terms of ontology, metaphysics, values, complex theoretical presuppositions, all that, but also hands-on practical knowledge that researchers need to be familiar with. And it's this set of attributes cannot really be reduced to a clear-cut method that you just apply to empirical reality. Maybe this is self-evident to all of you, but this is the premise for my discussion. So as practitioners of science or in a field related to science, we need to be familiar with a quite large amount of unstated knowledge, like social practices, skill sets in terms of measurement and how we use measuring apparatus, interpretations, how meaning in science is negotiated and constructed. And these skills do not very often get detailed explicitly. And sometimes they cannot even be understood outside the specific context. Sometimes you cannot transcribe these skills into something that's intelligible outside the context, especially when they regard unformed knowledge. For instance, I get some feedback. Would you like me to pause for a second? I'll just go on. So there's also a complex interrelationship between philosophical and ideological presuppositions and these practical considerations of science that even go into they go into the implementation of methods and even how facts and observations are constituted in certain situations in science. So we have to learn, or we have to be taught how to see certain things, one could say. For instance, when you learn how to make observations with a microscope, it's not self-evident, but you need to be schooled into the empirical practices. And these skill sets often go unmentioned, and they cannot easily reduce to abstract theoretical content. That's my point. I can perhaps skip a little bit forward here, because I think my basic premise is kind of obvious. So we can just observe that science resembles this complex network of historical traditions, historically situated traditions of knowledge. And science also often connect with knowledge gathering or knowledge interpreting activities that go beyond the scope of science proper. I mean, there are skills and forms of knowledge here that are necessary, but that's not really scientific knowledge. So, for instance, we have values and we have metaphysical knowledge that go into issues like what is the purpose of science and how will science contribute to society, and in terms of causal relationships and these sorts of things. And the characteristics of science I try to outline here, in my view, will mean that this network of historically situated forms of knowledge gathering and knowledge improving activities is going to be vulnerable in terms of constraints upon the informational environment, upon the aesthetic environment even, and upon the context in which knowledge is produced. We need to have a certain set of preconditions for science to properly operate. And if this gets disrupted, something happens to science. That's my point. Even it has been argued that even the style of scientific communication has an important impact on the subsequent knowledge that gets produced. A German philosopher by the name of Paul Feyerabend, he argued that the distinctive style of physicists Jan von Neumann and Niels Bohr, that the separate styles produced distinct schools which approached knowledge in various ways. So even these kinds of considerations can be important, is my point. So science, to operate normally and fruitfully, is dependent upon the free and unimpeded flow of information and the free proliferation and interactions of all kinds of knowledge, all kinds of tacit and explicit knowledge, skills, theories, and abilities to interpret and understand the world. And it's this vulnerability I see is threatened by digitalization and the rollout of artificial intelligence tools and certain applications of the technology. And I think this process may prove quite disruptive for science as a set of historically situated traditions of knowledge. Here's a vast number of points I just mentioned, but just you can just take a quick look at this. So this is a list of areas where I argue that the current developments in terms of digitalizations and AI may impact on science as a set of knowledge producing and knowledge gathering traditions, and we're going to get into the detail of all of these step by step. And also, I see that these challenges that are inherent or particular to the technology are also accompanied by certain ideological developments that may impact the governance of science and how the social and political functions of science are prescribed. So these developments do not only carry epistemic effects, but I think they also may disrupt the institutional cohesion of science, how this interlocking set of institutions operate together. And ultimately, I think there's a threat to academic freedom itself. I'll show you what I mean in a second. Technologically speaking, I think the most pervasive risk of the broader techno-social context is something I call decontextualization. And this, in my definition, is a process by which scientific communication, theorizing, and informational output gets dislodged from its localized and immediate cultural context, because it has to adapt to the constraints of digital technology and of the broader the frameworks that emerge to steward and govern science. And this is, of course, a broader long-term historical development that relates to the emergence of standards and platforms in the digital frameworks. So it's not only related to these last 10 years of technological development. And when I talk about decontextualization in practice, an example would be like how tools like generative AI will tend to disconnect analysis, interpretation, and output from local, tangible, and situated human realities. So research, I would argue, in the digital context, if you implement or use generative AI, will be less characterized by this immediate hands-on knowledge of culturally and locally situated researchers, practitioners, where these people's unique knowledge and competence may come into play. And whereas in the digital situation characterized by use of generative AI tools, the research will tend towards becoming more generic and flattened out, so it can be adapted and universalized and adapted to the non-local digital framework. So both the platforms and the tools will produce this effective decontextualization and sort of disconnect the output from this richer set of knowledge producing traditions that normally has been the legacy framework of what we know as science. You can also argue that generative AI is an artifact of this general process of decontextualization, since what generative AI does in some respects is to generate a kind of simulacrum or illusion of analysis, which in the actual sense is all interpretation, analysis, and creative output arguably is by definition localized, since an actual human consciousness needs to sift through the information and provide a rational reflection. But the AI simulation of analysis would amount to something like a decontextualized representation of something that looks like rational reflection, which is based in some average of patterns detected from human output. So what we get is something like the decontextualized likeness of actual human reflection and thought. And that discussion aside, I think the risks of these tools when they enter into the methods and practices of science are many, because an important problem here is that they will likely tend to erode the need for a for a broad range of skills in the researcher. Generative AI today makes it, for instance, less necessary for us to learn a foreign language or to understand the details of the practice in another field of science. And I would argue that this can erode the complex skill set that is necessary for science to thrive. That it can erode the complex skill sets of researchers that has been the legacy foundation of what we know as modern science today. And it could emphasize a process towards deeper and more myopic specialization, perhaps hyper-specialization, we could say. The risk, in my view, is that some kind of shortcuts that sort of substitute for these complex skill sets at the bottom of scientific research get substituted by AI tools, which might work in the short term or might work in a pinch, but in the long run, the entire complex of scientific research might be the poorer as a result. That's perhaps a complex argument, but I hope you get my point. And I think we already see this broad entrenchment of AI technologies throughout the methodological and operational chains of research, since these tools nowadays have an increasing significance in terms of everything from measuring instruments to data collection, and also in some extent the analysis and research output, even teaching and often studying as well. And there's a further interesting risk here, which is connected to something which is called model collapse, but it has in a lighter or less serious form been called something like recursive information feedback loops or spurious correlations. And spurious correlations is an example of this situation when error gets spread in the data, the training data of the AI, the large language models that are used in a lot of generative AI. And it's for instance, when we have training data that factor into like AI-assisted medical diagnoses, and you have a situation where the outcomes are good. You see that the tools assist in diagnoses, but in fact, it is for the wrong reasons. It's because the model has picked up on a sort of correlation that gets the prediction correct in relation to a limited data set, but only due to correlations which are actually not related to any underlying causal mechanisms. So the prediction mechanism is inherently unreliable, even though it seems to get things right in terms of the limited data set. And due to the increasing amounts of training data involved in these processes, in training these tools and creating the output, it's increasingly difficult for researchers to verify and validate these actual underlying correlations within the operations of the large language model. So the risk is that these spurious correlations may get entrenched into the body of knowledge that is used to produce further scientific research and information. Yeah, there's a lot to say here. I don't know how I am for time, but I will try to. Yeah, I'll just go ahead. There's a lot to say here, especially how the ideological effects of artificial intelligence technologies may get entrenched also in the bodies of scientific knowledge in a way that other technologies or tools of analysis cannot reproduce. It's but that's I'm not going to get into that discussion because it's a quite complex sidebar in and of itself. But I also mentioned, apart from these recursive informational feedback loops, that I see, at least I observe what I think is a process towards a narrowing of the scientific discourse in terms of these the institutional behavior of these major organizations that support grants and create policies for science at an international level. And I think that there's an example of this is how scientific misinformation is targeted for suppression at an overarching international level. And so something like something which is considered erroneous scientific points of view gets targeted by not outright censorship, but by discourse moderating activities, you could call it. And this process is I think is a broad aspect of the contemporary political and institutional landscape. It has deep ideological and technological roots, I think, which connects with the character of mass communications media and the role and meaning and function of science within the modern worldview. But I think that current developments should be considered to an extent a response to certain risks, which are particular to AI and the digital transformation. So policymakers see the risks that these tools may be used to serve the proliferation of unwanted points of view, and they try to sort of nip it in the bud. But here's also a risk that the healthy, useful, self-correcting practices of scientific research and scientific work get sort of sidetracked by these heavy-handed institutional approaches that are also assisted by technologies like artificial intelligence. And I see this kind of emergency epistemic heuristics that divide between the ignorant dissidents and the orthodox believers, which is a kind of dichotomy that normally should have no place in scientific discourse. And I think there's a risk here that the social and political authority of a narrow image of science gets entrenched within the contemporary mediatic and political landscape. So I think these factors I talked about previously, I think all of them come together in the emergence of overarching digital platforms which are geared towards governing science. An example is the laudable, I think, open science project that UNESCO has spearheaded, which has many positive aspects to it, but it also brings these risks with it and sort of dragged behind this major institutional process. So I think there's a risk that something like the UNESCO Open Science Project will enforce decontextualization, as I have defined it, upon scientific research. So And I think probably the most glaring example of this risk is how you see these major institutional efforts toward the suppression of something called scientific misinformation, and how this gets connected to projects for implementing AI towards disrupting unwanted discourses. And here you have several of the most influential think tanks and scientific academies, such as the British Royal Society or the APA, which emphasize the need for urgently implementing algorithmic suppression of scientific misinformation for purposes of national security. And this might sound commendable in the context and the situation we live in, but there are obvious risks when we take a closer look at the proposed methodologies for this moderation of the discourse. So I read a paper in Nature from 2021 by Cohen and others, and they provide an example for how this method often seems to be envisioned. The method for identifying and thwarting unwanted factual and theoretical claims within science. And the authors of this paper, what they did is they trained a large language model on the most influential sources of what they had flagged as theoretical and factual claims that were unwanted or non-scientific, like the sources of claims they targeted for suppression. And they used the resulting patterns for identifying new or additional instances of that should be targeted for suppression. And one can just note here that this type of filtering, pattern recognizing detection, it cannot discern nuances in the argumentation that surrounds the information. You can only recognize a similar pattern that gets repeated. And it cannot at all do justice to any novel arguments or new warrant for these claims that come into the debate. So what happens if there arises new important empirical data that actually challenges established scientific paradigms? This will get suppressed if you use this method to its end, which I think is something we should be very wary of. There's also a follow-up interview upon this paper by Cohen and others in Scientific American, and the authors say they're now working towards developing tools for the real-time detection and debunking of scientific misinformation. And this is connected to a project that was spearheaded by Google and Cambridge University and the BBC, where something that's called pre-bunking is implemented. And a pre-bunking would mean that a certain discourse or certain points of view get actively discouraged before they can enter the conversation. That's the idea. So if Einstein's challenges to the established Newtonian physics would have gotten pre-bunked effectively like 100 years ago, 120 years ago, that would probably have had an impact on, we might not have quantum theory. I mean, on the other hand, we might not have had nuclear weapons as well, but it would have impacted the processes of science and the potential for what we would call scientific development in a significant way. Right. So I think my point is probably quite clear here, but I see these efforts are mirrored in many of these large institutional bodies that are producing science policy and which are in charge of creating grants and in general guiding scientific research. And there are important synergies, especially the mandatory character of the open science framework that UNESCO spearheads will mean, for instance, that I, as a philosopher, will have to provide research data on basically the same premises as a physicist, which sort of does not do justice to the different character of the data that emerges within the respective fields. And it also would force this tacit knowledge, this knowledge that cannot really properly be transcribed into another format, but it would force us to actually try to do so. And the output might, in the worst case, get misleading, I think. Right. So I think my point is as clearly expressed as I can manage. But yeah, so this drive towards integrating AI tools into science carries with it a certain set of risks that I think are not seriously appreciated. And I think that's a worthwhile topic of discussion, and not only in terms of the epistemic issues or the legal issues, but also in terms of how it sort of, what it does for knowledge production in our society in general.
Yeah, Jan, you have 4 minutes more.
I have 4 minutes. I'll just try to close. So an example is how I think there's a lack of understanding of the complex nature of science, and the epistemology I see reflected in these bodies that advocate for a rapid rollout of AI technology in science. It's limited and does not reflect the complexity of the actual practice on the ground or in the field that pertains to scientific research. And an example is how the EUA Open Science Agenda 2025 emphasizes how now we shall return to Karl Popper's falsification, the notion of falsification, that we separate proper scientific knowledge from non-scientific knowledge by whether it's falsifiable or not. But philosophy of science has been we rejected these ideas almost 100 years ago, and it has been internally criticized for almost a century. So this sort of exemplifies a deterioration in the quality of epistemic reflection within these bodies that produce policy for science. And when this perspective will also be sort of mass reproduced through the implementation of AI tools, not only for research, but also for governing what is proper science and what is not proper science, I think there's a risk here that combines this lack of proper epistemic knowledge with certain ideological objectives in a way that might threaten the integrity of scientific research and academic freedom. So, I mean, if I can just finish and sum up, I think we have moved during the last half century from a context where researchers and academics made the utmost care to establish how complex and how situated truth claims were, and we used key theoretical tools like discourse analysis and social constructionist approaches to emphasize and explore this. And now we've moved into this black and white situation where you have truth and you have falsehood, and we're going back to Karl Popper, and you see think tanks within the European Parliament making statements like the gullibility of students with regard to false scientific views, like this would be a reasonable epistemic distinction. And we have these black and white qualifiers that seem to separate the orthodox adherents of proper science from, and I quote again, scientific communication non-believers. I mean, what is this? What are we talking about here? And my fear is that science, as we have known it, not least through the impact of digital technology and how these technologies are received and implemented, it may be transforming into something that is no longer science. Do I have time to give you a quote from? I'm not sure. Have I 2 more minutes?
1
I can
minute.
wrap it up.
You have one.
I'll give you one. All right. So this is a quote from Michael Polanyi, the Hungarian-British polymath scientist, and he was describing the contradictions of the Soviet sciences in a quite different societal situation. But I think my misgivings kind of echo his sentiment here. So I quote, I first met questions of philosophy when I came up against the Soviet ideology under Stalin, which denied justification to the pursuit of science. I remember a conversation I had with Bukharin in Moscow in 1935. Though he was heading toward his fall and execution 3 years later, he was still a leading theoretician of the Communist Party. When I asked him about the pursuit of pure science in Soviet Russia, he said that pure science was a morbid symptom of a class society. Under socialism, the conception of science pursued for its own sake would disappear, for the interests of scientists would spontaneously turn into problems of the current 5-year plan. So I think this is, maybe we're not heading in this direction, but there are certain risks that portend a similar development. I mean, we might be heading towards a situation where scientific knowledge is less about the pursuit of truth than something else. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, dear Jon. That was really interesting, and I totally agree that AI has already shaped scientific information and discourse in whole. And if you take an example of large linguistic models, they learn from the massive of data to see the correlation and to see what words uses often with other words. And of course, if someone fill the internet with conspiracy theories, so then AI can offer the answer to some questions, and it would be an answer from this conspiracy theories. But at the same time, we also don't know who are behind AI models. So we don't know who and how marking some information and as, okay, that's trustworthy answer, you can give it next time, for instance. Before we jump from the epistemic level of values to the implementation of them with the next presentation, we have time for questions, and there is one question from form to all speakers today. I will put it in chat, but also I see that there are some questions here. Katerina, please.
Yes,
we can't hear
thank
you.
you.
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Johan, for your fantastic presentation. That's really helpful and very informative. I'm far from AI and all connected to this topic, but I agree that at least what I see from my research activities, I am in human rights and in international criminal law. And I think that also I've noticed that how historical narratives are also the very corner of AI and producing information and producing knowledge. That's actually what Julia has mentioned just a second ago, and it was very much clear in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine, unfortunately. And yeah, with this remark, I just wanted to support the very relevance of your presentation and your research. And I have just one short question as a university teacher, because you talk about research and academia, and do you have an idea about specific risks and challenges for education from AI? Because these are very interconnected areas, especially when we talk about, research-informed education and education-informed research. Yeah, thank you again, and good luck with your further research.
Thank you so much. I guess I echo everyone's sentiment when I observe and affirm that, well, the use of large language models among student populations is a clear risk in terms of sort of eroding the training towards critical thinking and the capacities for rational reflection. I think we all see this, and I have no good answer or reasonable solution to these risks, because these technologies will likely they will enter the market and they will be used, and we just have to deal with the situation somehow. But I think there's at least a possible approach in terms of, well, I think the humanities need to come into focus as a supporting feature of the situation here, and we need to explore how we can use these tools in support of proper academic research and teaching. There's an example how you could use these. I mean, you can always use these large language models for specialized research and for finding the patterns that are necessary and interesting to explore further. But and I think we should attempt to approach education in the same sense, that if we can foster these crucial abilities of critical reflection and critical thinking and so on at the basis, I think we may, in the longer term, be able to fashion a way to approach the use of the tools in a more fruitful way. That's just many words to say a very simple thing.
Yeah.
But get the humanities back into research and science, I think, is a way forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is also one question from forum, because we asked participants after registration to fill their survey, and then there was some opportunity to leave the question if they want. So the question is, what do you think about the impact of AI on everyday life? Has it gotten better with AI? I suppose everyday life. Did people lose something valuable when there are many AI things? That's for every speaker. It's for today.
So it's for every speaker, but I'm supposed to answer it right now.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think we've lost something valuable, and I think we haven't gotten much in return yet. That's my overall assessment of the. And I think one of the key problems here, I'm not going to be long-winded, but one of the key problems is that actual human intentionality, actual human goal-directed activity in the social and academic life gets potentially pushed aside by these substitutes. And that, I think, is the basic foundation of why our situation, our social life, seems to be more impoverished. Yeah. Human agency gets pushed aside. I think that's a huge risk in the long term.
Thank you. And we have some more time, so if no one have questions, I have one. I don't see that. Okay, then I take this opportunity. My question is about future scenarios. Can you see some future scenarios do you see for this AI impact on science? What's in future?
Well, apart from what I already discussed here and the nightmare scenario of a science that gets turned into a caricature of its former self and doesn't really operate towards producing knowledge and truth anymore, I think let me try to be positive for a second. I see, for instance, how AI in this context could actually be used towards uncovering blind spots in the corpus of scientific knowledge. So I think AI, for instance, could be used towards identifying theories that are not sufficiently explored. You can sort of, if we say we have a large language model that scrutinizes the whole repository of our knowledge in physics, for instance, this tool could emphasize and point out where there are gaps or where there are potential new theoretical connections that could be made. So it could perhaps be a useful sort of shortcut to discovering points where we could really make a huge impact in terms of directed scientific research. So I mean, if we learn how to use these tools, I think there are significant potential in them as well.
Thank you. And thank you again for a brilliant presentation. That's a lot of things to sort then. Now I'm introducing the next speaker, Natalia Sakara, who is Associate Professor of the Department of International Civil and Commercial Law of the State University of Trade and Economics, and also she is a judge of the Cassation Civil Court of the Supreme Court. I think we will switch to Ukrainian now. Пані Наталія, запрошуємо вас до презентації. Тож, зараз ми будемо говорити про дуже практичні тепер речі, так, про електронний суд, практику впровадження та перспективи. У вас мікрофон вимкнений, ми вас не чуємо.
Я бачила. Доброго дня, шановні колеги. Я можу сказати, що мені дуже приємно взяти участь в роботі цієї панелі, тому що дійсно за використанням штучного інтелекту, це саме йому була присвячена попередня доповідь, за використання різного роду інформаційних технологій, майбутнє не лише в нашому повсякденному житті, наукових дослідженнях, а також і в судовій практиці. Можу сказати, що ми вже спостерігаємо, коли існують спроби використання штучного інтелекту під час написання різного роду пояснень, скарг на судові рішення. На жаль, суди не сприймають це. Про це свідчить, до речі, окрема думка, яка була ухвалена, точніше, окрема ухвала, яка була винесена суддями Касаційного господарського суду, коли ними було виявлено використання штучного інтелекту під час оскарження судових рішень. Ну, не всі судді, звісно, поділяють заборону використання штучного інтелекту, але, в принципі, вже мали місце такі випадки. Але моя доповідь не буде присвячена безпосередньо питанням штучного інтелекту. В той же час я буду зачіпати питання, скажімо, діджиталізації, або іншими словами, впровадження так званого електронного суду в сучасну правову систему України. Ну, одразу хочу сказати, що в науці цивільного процесуального права зустрічаються різні тлумачення поняття електронний суд, і взагалі використовуються різні терміни: і електронний суд, електронне судочинство, електронне правосуддя. Але одразу хочу сказати, що сьогодні я буду розглядати ті, скажімо, проблеми, з якими стикається судова практика, і ті новації, які з'явилися за останні роки, і пов'язані з використанням інформаційних технологій під час здійснення правосуддя. Одразу я хочу сказати, що все це почалося не вчора, не 5 років і навіть не 10 років тому, тому що перші, скажімо, такі прообрази використання інформаційних технологій в цивільному судочинстві ми можемо побачити ще за часів діяльності старих процесуальних кодексів, які діяли до 2004 року, коли було запроваджено запроваджено фіксування розгляду справи за допомогою технічних засобів. У подальшому, звісно, все це вийшло на зовсім інший рівень. Певні елементи, скажімо, електронних доказів ми можемо спостерігати в регулюванні Цивільно-процесуального кодексу і інших кодексів, починаючи з 2004 року, але, звісно, що прорив у використанні і надання можливості використовувати різного роду інформаційні технології, він відбувся саме з прийняттям в новій редакції процесуальних кодексів, які почали діяти з 15 грудня 2017 року. І оскільки починаючи з 15 грудня 2017 року було передбачено, що особа може звернутися до суду в електронній формі, використовуючи EACEA, але як така EACEA ще не була запроваджена, тобто єдина судова інформаційна телекомунікаційна система, в різних судах були запроваджені такі спроби використовувати EACEA, тобто були так звані модельні суди, але в принципі для того, щоб не допускати порушення прав людини і права на звернення до суду, з'явився такий спосіб звернення, коли особи, незважаючи на те, що такий спосіб не був передбачений в Цивільно-процесуальному кодексі і в інших кодексах, але особам дозволялося звертатися до суду, використовуючи електронну форму, шляхом пред'явлення їх документів і направлення їх документів на офіційну електронну адресу відповідного суду. Певний проміжок часу паралельно існувала можливість звернення до суду і в звичайній паперовій формі, і направлення на офіційну електронну адресу суду відповідних документів, але дещо змінилася ситуація, коли 5 жовтня 2021 року вже офіційно запрацювали деякі підсистеми EACEA. І в судовій практиці виникло питання, враховуючи те, що безпосередньо Цивільно-процесуальний кодекс визначає можливість звернення до суду в електронній формі саме з використанням можливостей EACEA, чи можна допускати звернення до суду шляхом направлення документів на офіційну електронну адресу суду. Оскільки у суддів були різні підходи до тлумачення цих процесуальних норм, і в тому числі були різні бачення продовження можливості використання такого способу у суддів касаційних судів, відповідна справа була передана на розгляд Великої Палати, і 13 вересня 2023 року Велика Палата Верховного суду, вона сформулювала свій правовий висновок по цьому питанню. Враховуючи те, що вже починаючи з минулого року були запроваджені імперативні правила, що деякі суб'єкти, а саме мова йде про адвокатів, нотаріусів, державних і приватних виконавців, арбітражних керуючих, судових експертів, органів державної влади, інших державних органів місцевого самоврядування, а з лютого вже всі юридичні особи, вони зобов'язані зареєструватися в EACEA, то Велика Палата дійшла до такого висновку, що в тому випадку, якщо особа, яка звертається до суду, не має обов'язку зареєструватися в EACEA, а не мають обов'язку лише фізичні особи, а також особи, які за певними релігіозними переконаннями не мають можливості зареєструватися в EACEA, то в такій ситуації вони можуть продовжувати використовувати такий спосіб звернення до суду в електронній формі, як шляхом направлення документів на офіційну електронну адресу суду. В той же час, якщо в інтересах цих осіб звертається до суду адвокат як представник, оскільки адвокат зобов'язаний зареєструватися, то в такій ситуації всі документи мають вже направлятися до суду в електронній формі з використанням EACEA. Ну і, звісно, всі суб'єкти, які зазначені в частині 6 статті 14 Цивільно-процесуального кодексу України, вони зобов'язані звертатися до суду в електронній формі, лише використовуючи можливості EACEA. Кому буде цікаво, ви зможете подивитися постанову цієї Великої Палати, але одразу, щоб не виникало непорозумінь, тому що я вам кажу, що адвокат не може звертатися шляхом направлення документів на офіційну електронну адресу суду. В принципі, саме про це певною мірою казала і апеляція по справі, яка передавалася на Велику Палату, але чомусь Велика Палата скасувала судове рішення і направила для продовження розгляду до суду апеляційної інстанції цю справу. Хочу пояснити цю ситуацію, тому що тут потрібно дуже уважно читати це рішення, щоб зрозуміти все ж таки позицію Великої Палати. По цій справі була ситуація, що адвокат, звертаючись до суду першої інстанції в інтересах свого клієнта, він використовував підсистеми EACEA, але до апеляції він звертався саме з використанням офіційної електронної адреси суду. У зв'язку з тим, що на момент, коли йому потрібно було направити документи до суду, були технічні проблеми в роботі EACEA. Про це ним було зазначено, але апеляція не перевіряла на момент повернення його апеляційної скарги, чи відповідає ця інформація дійсності. І, відповідно, Велика Палата, хоча і сформулювала положення, що адвокат не може використовувати офіційну електронну адресу, все ж таки, враховуючи і допускаючи можливість певних технічних збоїв в роботі EACEA, направила до суду апеляційної інстанції для того, щоб в суді все ж таки було перевірена інформація, надана адвокатам, і, відповідно, з врахуванням практики Європейського суду з прав людини, який передбачає, що не можна обмежувати доступ до суду, в тому випадку, якщо особа скористалася своїм правом, але не має можливості реалізувати його через технічні збої, відповідно, на це питання має вже остаточно дати відповідь суд апеляційної інстанції, але ми таким чином можемо зробити висновок, що ті суб'єкти, які зобов'язані зареєструватися в EACEA, якщо вони не мають можливості реалізувати своє право в певний момент саме через технічні збої, то вони можуть зібрати докази про це і, відповідно, скористуватися іншими шляхами звернення до суду, але при цьому вказувати про наявність технічних збоїв в роботі EACEA. Інший, скажімо, аспект, пов'язаний з використанням різного роду інформаційних технологій в судовій діяльності, пов'язаний з тим, що вже допускаючи можливість звернення до суду в електронній формі, поступово сформульовані вимоги до оформлення документів, які подаються до суду. Незалежно від того, чи це буде звернення через EACEA, чи це буде звернення шляхом направлення документів на офіційну електронну адресу суду, якщо це фізична особа, але в будь-якому випадку всі документи мають бути в обов'язковому порядку підписані за допомогою електронного цифрового підпису. Якщо документи направляються з використанням EACEA, то це передбачає, що особа у своєму кабінеті обирає формуляр документа, який вона хоче подати до суду, заповнює його, відповідно додає потрібні додатки і вже використовуючи надіслати, таким чином підписує за допомогою електронного цифрового підпису направлені документи. В тому випадку, якщо документи надсилаються на офіційну електронну адресу суду, то тут особа має прослідкувати, щоб вона використала цю можливість саме підписання. В Законі України про судовий збір було передбачено, що як тільки запрацюють всі підсистеми EACEA, то особи, які будуть використовувати електронну форму звернення до суду, будуть мати певні пільги у сплаті судового збору, а саме, що при зверненні до суду буде використовуватися понижуючий коефіцієнт 0,8. Знов-таки, у суддів були певний проміжок часу, різні позиції, з якого моменту цей коефіцієнт має застосовуватися, тому що навіть зараз не всі підсистеми, які були, EACEA, які були заплановані, вони вже функціонують. Питання було передано на розгляд Великої Палати, і Велика Палата зробила висновок, що з того моменту, коли хоч якась підсистема запрацювала, і особа змінює свою поведінку, тобто вона вже використовує електронну форму звернення до суду, то вона має правомірні очікування розраховувати на понижуючі коефіцієнти. І тому зараз, незалежно від того, яку електронну форму використовує особа, до документів, які мають сплачуватися судовим збором, застосовується, точніше, понижуючий коефіцієнт 0,8. І у зв'язку з тим, що відбулися певні процеси переходу від паперового судочинства до електронного судочинства, допускається і надання платіжних доручень або квитанцій на підтвердження сплати судового збору, які роздруковуються не безпосередньо в банку, звіряються печаткою банку, а які можуть надсилатися платнику в його кабінеті як користувача послуг банку в форматі онлайн. І в такій ситуації достатньо особі роздрукувати цей документ, якщо вона подає документи в паперовому варіанті, або PDF-файл додати до свого звернення і направити його до суду. На відміну від тих вимог, які пред'являлися раніше, а це в обов'язковому порядку підпис посадової особи банку, а також, скажімо, так звана мокра печатка банку, зараз все це не обов'язково. І оскільки не всі поки що особи зареєструвалися в EACEA, для того, щоб не допускати порушення прав учасників процесу, які не зобов'язані реєструватися і, відповідно, не зареєстровані, але для того, щоб вони були обізнані про ту справу, яка розглядається в суді, в положеннях Цивільно-процесуального кодексу, як і в інших кодексах, передбачено, що перш ніж направляти в електронній формі документи до суду, копії цих документів в паперовій формі потрібно направити іншим учасникам справи. І на підтвердження виконання цього обов'язку особа повинна надати суду лист з описом вкладення, який оформлюється поштовими працівниками на підтвердження виконання цього обов'язку. Деякі суб'єкти намагаються певною мірою хитрувати. Це може бути свідомо або несвідомо, тому що, самі розумієте, звернення до пошти тягне додаткові витрати, усі пов'язані з пересиланням документів. І вони намагаються уникнути цього і надсилають документи на електронну адресу свого контрагента і надають суду скріншот з електронної пошти на підтвердження виконання ними свого обов'язку. Але такий скріншот не зараховується судами, виходячи з того, що, по-перше, у суду немає можливості переконатися, що дійсно та адреса, на яку направлені документи, це адреса іншого учасника справи. Крім того, по, скажімо, тим картинкам, які суд бачить на скріншоті, він не може побачити, а що за документ безпосередньо направлений учаснику справи. І тому в практиці сформувалася така позиція, що якщо ви хочете, ви можете направляти іншому учаснику справи, який не зобов'язаний реєструватися в EACEA, документи на його особисту електронну пошту, але це не буде вважатися тим, що ви його повідомили, і тому в будь-якому випадку ви повинні надіслати лист з описом іншому учаснику справи. В тому випадку, якщо інший учасник справи має зареєстрований електронний кабінет в EACEA, і, відповідно, особа звертається до суду з використанням можливостей EACEA, Він звільняється від обов'язку направляти в паперовій формі документи іншому учаснику справи, тому що все це відбувається автоматично. І суддя, отримуючи документи, знов-таки в своєму електронному кабінеті, він має можливість, по-перше, з'ясувати, в кого з учасників справи наявні зареєстровані електронні кабінети, і, відповідно, з підсистеми електронний суд роздрукувати довідку на підтвердження того, що іншому учаснику справи в його електронний кабінет були надіслані відповідні документи. Існують певні особливості, що стосуються оформлення документів на підтвердження повноважень представника. Якщо ви вже вивчали цивільний процес, ви могли побачити, що, в принципі, за загальним правилом повноваження представника посвідчуються довіреністю або ордером. І в Цивільно-процесуальному кодексі були передбачені положення, що довіреність має бути нотаріально посвідчена. Але в тому випадку, якщо доручення оформлюється безпосередньо в підсистемі електронний суд, то не потрібно його нотаріально посвідчувати. Чому? Тому що підсистема електронний суд, вона розроблена таким чином, що електронне доручення може бути видано лише в тому випадку, якщо у учасника справи наявний електронний цифровий підпис, і він зареєстрований в підсистемі електронний суд, і, відповідно, його представник, адвокат, так само має електронний цифровий підпис і зареєстрований. І, відповідно, коли учасник видає доручення, він підтверджує повноваження представника за допомогою свого електронного підпису. І оце доручення оформлюється знов-таки шляхом заповнення формуляру. І система працює таким чином, що втручання в цей процес неможливо. І, відповідно, сумнівів в тому, що учасник справи дійсно уповноважив саме цю особу діяти від його імені, не виникає. Тому відпадає потреба у зверненні до нотаріуса для оформлення цього доручення. Що стосується оформлення ордеру адвоката. Ну, в першу чергу, оскільки вимоги до ордеру пред'являються не процесуальним законодавством, а вимоги щодо оформлення, вони пред'являються безпосередньо, розробляються, точніше, безпосередньо Національна асоціація адвокатів України.
Я перепрошую, пані Наталі, ви ще маєте 10 хвилин, можете трошечки повільніше, бо перекладачі не встигають.
Добре, я спробую. Так от, що стосується оформлення повноважень адвоката, то ордер, він має відповідати вимогам положення про ордер. І в положенні зазначено, що ордер має бути підписаний адвокатом у відповідній графі. І оскільки адвокат формує ордер не в підсистемі EACEA, а в своєму кабінеті на сайті Національної асоціації адвокатів України, в нього немає можливості зробити відмітку в ордері, не роздрукувавши його. Відповідно, адвокати мають роздрукувати ордер, підписати цей ордер, відсканувати його і в якості додатку додавати до документів, які направляються до суду. В червні 2024 року Національна асоціація адвокатів України намагалася полегшити життя адвокатам. Були внесені зміни до положення про адвокатуру, де було передбачено, що ордер буде вважатися підписаним адвокатом, якщо він додається до електронного документу, який підписаний офіційним електронним підписом. Ну, я би сказала так, хотіли зробити як краще, вийшло як завжди, не зовсім долуге. Чому? Тому що після того, як ордер сформований, і після того, як адвокат його приєднує в якості файла вже в системі EACEA до документів, які подаються до суду, то ми вже можемо розуміти, додається не оригінал ордеру, а додається його копія. А знов-таки для того, щоб суд розглядав завірену належним чином копію документа, вона має відповідати формі. Якщо він не підписаний, він є недійсним. Тому зараз, поки така недолуга ситуація з цими ордерами, між суддями починаються, скажімо, такі, я не можу сказати переговори, але ми починаємо обговорювати питання, що давайте дещо спростимо свої вимоги до оформлення, тому що адвокати спростили свої положення. Ну, поки, скажімо, єдності в думках між суддями немає, тому що, в принципі, ці питання поки що до суддів Верховного суду не надходили з приводу оформлення цих ордерів. Що стосується електронних доказів, електронні докази вони можуть подаватися до суду в оригіналі, в електронній копії, яка засвідчена електронним цифровим підписом, і може бути подана паперова копія, яка посвідчена в порядку, встановленому законом. В тому випадку, якщо ми електронний доказ перетворюємо в паперову копію, це ніяким чином на доказовому значенні цього доказу не впливає. Частіше за все, звісно, коли мова йде про електронні докази, ми стикаємося з електронними документами, але електронні докази не обмежуються лише електронними документами, тому що це може бути відеозапис, аудіозапис, який не є електронним документом, але все рівно це електронний доказ. Ну і головною особливістю електронних доказів є те, що відсутня жорстка прив'язка до якогось конкретного матеріального носія. Після запровадження можливості використання інформаційних технологій в цивільному процесі з'явилася знов-таки можливість і повідомляти учасників справи новими способами. До внесення змін влітку 2023 року було передбачено, що повідомлення учасника відбувається шляхом направлення йому інформації на офіційну електронну пошту. Зазвичай ця офіційна електронна пошта, вона реєструвалася в EACEA, і її особливістю було те, що адреса складалася з цифр, які зазвичай були ідентифікаційним кодом особи, потім так звана собачка, і було закінчення адреси mail.gov.ua. Тобто, і коли суди бачили цю адресу, можна було одразу сказати, що це офіційна електронна пошта. Але після того, як дещо було відкориговано під системи EACEA, зараз мова йде про направлення інформації в електронний кабінет. Він не має якоїсь адреси. Тобто скористатися можливістю направлення інформації до електронного кабінету можна лише в підсистемі EACEA. І, в принципі, матеріали справи, інформацію по справі, яка існує в електронній формі, EACEA автоматично направляє всім учасникам справи. Можливість перевірити, чи є учасникам електронний кабінет чи ні, вона існує в тому випадку, якщо зазначений ідентифікаційний код. Тобто в електронному кабінеті кожен суддя може ввести ідентифікаційний код і побачити, чи зареєстрована особа у встановленому законом порядку. Так само існує можливість повідомляти учасників справи шляхом розміщення оголошення на офіційному веб-сайті судової влади. Але цей спосіб має певні особливості, не завжди він вважається належним. В першу чергу, цей спосіб використовується в тому випадку, якщо учасник справи знаходиться на окупованій території. І в такий спосіб зараз суди намагаються повідомити громадян Російської Федерації і безпосередньо Російську Федерацію, якщо вони є учасниками справи. Ми визначаємо належність цього способу залежно від місцезнаходження учасника справи. В тому випадку, якщо у нас всі учасники знаходяться на неокупованій території, то повідомляти шляхом оголошення на офіційному веб-сайті судової влади ми можемо лише певне коло учасників. Тобто це відповідач, третя особа, свідок, і лише за умови, якщо їх зареєстроване місце проживання, місце знаходження чи місце роботи невідомо. Якщо по матеріалам справи можемо визначити адресу відповідача, то такий спосіб буде неналежним. І незалежно від того, чи відома адреса, чи невідома адреса, в такий спосіб можна повідомляти заінтересовану особу у справі про видачу обмежувального припису. Повідомлення позивача в такий спосіб розглядається як неналежне. Звісно, існують нюанси по кожній конкретній справі, тобто це загальний підхід, який я вам сказала, але судді намагаються дотримуватися цього порядку, і що стосується суб'єктного складу, і що стосується місцезнаходження. Можливість використання інших способів, а саме телефонограма, смс-повідомлення, мобільний додаток, Viber, Messenger або опублікування судового рішення в Єдиному державному реєстрі судових рішень – все це за загальним правилом неналежний спосіб. Чому кажу за загальним правилом? Тому що за певних умов телефонограма буде належним, але мають бути умови, зазначені в частині 9 статті 128 Цивільно-процесуального кодексу. Що стосується смс-повідомлення, то перш ніж використовувати такий спосіб, потрібно пересвідчитися, чи давала особа письмову згоду на використання такого способу. Якщо вона просто зазначає в документах, які подаються до суду, свій номер телефона, це не вважається згодою. І враховуючи специфіку, в якій опинилася судова система зараз, а специфіка пов'язана і з воєнними діями, і з недостатнім фінансуванням, і з тим, що чимало осіб виїхали за межі України, відповідно, намагалися повідомляти учасників справи, які як засіб зв'язку вказували свої особисті електронні пошти, шляхом направлення їм таку інформацію. І, відповідно, в практиці виробилася так звана презумпція обізнаності, яка дозволяла в такий спосіб повідомляти. Але Велика Палата 10 квітня 2024 року розглянула це питання і сказала, що такий спосіб він може використовуватися як додатковий, але він не звільняє суддів від обов'язку направляти повідомлення повістками, тобто в звичайній паперовій формі. Але коли мова йде про повідомлення, звісно, судді і судді вищестоящих інстанцій, вони звертають увагу і мають звертати увагу не лише на те, чи виконаний обов'язок судами, чи повідомлені, чи направлені повістки, а також враховує поведінку учасника справи. Тому що в Цивільно-процесуальному кодексі передбачений принцип добросовісності і заборона зловживання. І відповідно, якщо з матеріалів справи вбачається, що особа повідомлена, вона зловживає своїми правами, то відповідні наслідки мають застосовуватися судами. І остання, скажімо, така інформаційна технологія, яка використовується під час судового розгляду, я маю на увазі так, поширена його використання, це можливість участі в судовому засіданні в режимі відеоконференції. Поштовхом до активного використання відеоконференції стало оголошення карантину, коли була обмежена можливість доступу до приміщень судів. Але в подальшому, знов-таки, оскільки чимало осіб виїхали за межі України, і як в тому випадку, якщо вони хочуть особисто взяти участь в судовому засіданні, бути присутнім, але в них немає такої фізичної можливості, вони можуть скористатися режимом відеоконференції. Для цього потрібно подати клопотання не пізніше, ніж за 5 днів, робочих днів до проведення судового засідання. Відповідно, якщо у суду буде технічна можливість, я маю на увазі, якщо в суді наявне відповідне обладнання для проведення судового засідання в режимі відеоконференції, то в такій ситуації це клопотання буде задоволено, і учасник буде мати можливість, використовуючи, тобто заходячи в EACEA, з використанням відповідної програми, яка фіксує EasyCon, він має можливість підключитися до відеоконференції, відповідно, оскільки підключаючись, встановлюється його особа через електронний цифровий підпис, то тут проблем не виникає, і таким чином брати участь в судовому засіданні. Єдине, що коли учасник заявляє клопотання про участь в судовому засіданні в режимі відеоконференції, то він для себе має з'ясовувати, як він хоче взяти участь. Чи це буде використовуючи власні технічні засоби, чи він може з'явитися до іншого суду і, відповідно, підключатися через технічні засоби, встановлені в іншому суді. Але все це між
Пані
судами...
Наталія, перепрошую, 2 хвилини маєте.
Я закінчую вже. Так, єдине, що коли учасник справи заявляє клопотання про участь в судовому засіданні в режимі відеоконференції з використанням власних технічних засобів, то всі ризики, пов'язані з тим, чи зможе він підключитися, чи зможе він взяти належну участь в судовому засіданні, вони покладаються на нього. І відповідно, якщо в нього не вдалося підключитися, то в такій ситуації суд може розцінити таку поведінку як неявка без поважної причини. В тому випадку, якщо учасник хоче скористатися технічними можливостями іншого суду, то в такій ситуації вже ризик перекладається на інший суд. І якщо щось сталося, або оголошена тривога, або відсутнє енергопостачання, то в такій ситуації судове засідання відкладається. Ну і, до речі, оцей режим відеоконференції, його специфіка полягає в тому, що, в принципі, в електронному кабінеті судді, не можу вам сказати, що стосується електронного кабінету учасника справи, наявні ці записи, тобто працюючи в електронному кабінеті судді, у нас є можливість проглядати цю відеоконференцію і бачити, що відбувалося під час судового засідання. Я дякую вам за увагу. Якщо будуть якісь питання, я готова на них відповісти.
Дуже дякуємо, пані Наталя. Точно будуть. У мене є питання, і я вже відчуваю, що тут є також бажаючі. Дуже дякуємо, пані Наталі, за таку докладну презентацію. Я думаю, що ми всі зараз знаємо більше про те, як імплементується електронний суд і різні інформаційні технології. І дякую за те, що ви пояснили, як інформаційні технології в суді зараз допомагають нам в ситуації агресії проти Російської Федерації. Я також хочу сказати, що пані Наталі є одною з авторок книги, якою ми поділилися в чаті. Книга у відкритому доступі є, тож запрошую всіх прочитати ці доробки. І я, якщо можна, скористаюся питанням і потім дам можливість іншим сказати. Моє питання про ризики. Чи є якісь специфічні ризики для права на справедливий суд, які обумовлені впровадженням електронного суду?
Ну, дивіться, ризики, звісно, є. В першу чергу, ризики пов'язані з тим, що, наприклад, в цивільно-процесуальному кодексі передбачено, що ті учасники, які зобов'язані зареєструватися в електронному суді, тобто враховуючи, що вже пройшло майже рік, з лютого тут півроку, тобто ми виходимо з того, що всі вже виконали обов'язок. Якщо ви не виконали обов'язок, ви зловживаєте своїми, скажімо так, правами. І повідомлення цих учасників відбувається лише в електронній формі. Тобто, ніхто вже, якщо це не фізична особа, не направляє в паперовій формі судові рішення на звичайні адреси таких учасників. Ну, я розумію, що тут, знаєте, по інерції суди ще можуть направляти, але вони не повинні, і це не порушення. Перекладений ризик, тобто на інших учасників справи. Але ми розуміємо, що не завжди, оскільки ЄСІВці є більш-менш такою новою програмою, вона доопрацьовується, не завжди вона працює злагоджена. Дуже часто бувають технічні збої, бувають ті моменти, коли учасник не отримав документи, бувають такі можливості, коли учасник не має можливості отримати документи, тобто існують такі ризики. Звісно, що ми розуміємо, існують ризики різного роду кібератак. Існує ризик, наприклад, коли слухається справа в режимі відеоконференції, на жаль, з власного досвіду можу сказати, що зв'язок залишає кращого, тобто дуже погано чутно, тому що шуми. В тому випадку, якщо розглядається справа, наприклад, з перекладачем, тому що коли ми розглядаємо справи, в нас немає синхронного перекладу, тобто особа дала пояснення, перекладач перекладає. Знов-таки, якщо учасники знаходяться в різних місцях, відповідно, відбувається спотворення інформації. Тому, звісно, ризики існують, хоча я можу сказати, що в порівнянні з тим, що було 5 років тому, Україна пройшла дуже швидко, достатньо складний шлях. І ті технології, які зараз в нас вже існують, вони на достатньо такому високому рівні.
Так, дякую, пані Наталія. Я бачу, що є 2 питання у Йоанна і у Наталії. Please, Йоанн.
It's just a quick question. Do you see a risk that national and regional sovereignty over legal processes sort of get eroded over court proceedings? Because now the court process can operate without regard for regional and geographical boundaries and jurisdictions in principle. So do you see a risk that this kind of threatens national sovereignty in terms of a state's legal structure and legal self-sufficiency in a sense?
Ну, скажімо так, я ніколи не думала про це, але якщо знов-таки, тому що, наприклад, враховуючи тему вашої доповіді, штучний інтелект, ми поки не розглядали можливість використання штучного інтелекту, хоча декілька тижнів тому відбувся з'їзд суддів і, в принципі, виходячи з Кодексу суддівської етики, нам не заборонено використовувати можливості штучного інтелекту. Що стосується якихось загроз, в будь-якому випадку використання інформаційних технологій ми накладаємо на вже існуючі процесуальні норми, і, відповідно, ми не змінюємо правила розгляду справи під. Тобто відбувається певне коригування, але ті норми процесуального права, ті гарантії, ті принципи, вони є більш-менш сталими. Що стосується, скажімо, якогось зовнішнього впливу, втручання, тому що я можу сказати, що на початку 2022 року, в січні, в нас була ситуація, коли через кібератаку були пошкоджені наші ресурси, тобто це ще до початку війни, коли ми не змогли скористатися своїми електронними поштами, нам все змінили. Тобто, звісно, це є, але, на жаль, я не зовсім розуміюся в цих, знаєте, технічних можливостей. Я не можу пояснити якісь там, чи використовуються додаткові системи захисту для інформації, яка передається. Тому тут, вибачте, будь ласка. Я сподіваюся, я відповіла на питання.
Дякуємо, пані Наталя. І перед перервою ми маємо ще 5 хвилин, тому ось ще одне питання від пані Наталі Філатової, Білоус.
Так, дуже дякую, Наталія Юріївно, за таку дуже ґрунтовну доповідь, дуже цікаво. Якщо можна, я на правах співмодератора трошки для наших іноземних колег прокоментую і спробую, знаєте, як більш візуалізувати ось цей наш ЄСІЦ. Наталія Юріївно, як ви думаєте, я не порушу нічого, якщо виведу на екран те, як просто виглядає наш електронний кабінет в електронному суді?
Ні, тому що ви показуєте свою частину, тобто це ваш електронний кабінет, тому тут ніякого порушення немає.
Дякую. So, dear colleagues, dear our foreign colleagues, I'm now going to share with you the way our electronic court looks like from the inside. So this is my electronic cabinet in this system, which is called EACEA, but we can translate it as electronic court. So here we have the incoming messages when you are notified about your current stage of your trials, which you have as an attorney or as a party to some dispute. You can also choose some preferences and you will see them here. You can also see all the cases in which you were involved. So personally, I combine two works as a teacher at the university and as a practicing lawyer. However, practicing lawyering is not my basic work. So that's why I have this cabinet, and this is also part of my job. And also you can here submit some documents and evidences and whatsoever. And I should say that during the war, this electronic system has improved very much, and it has helped us very, very much. I mean, when I say us, I mean not only professional lawyers, but also citizens and people who are involved into this or that trials, who want to defend their rights. Because, you know, we have a lot of problematic territories. I mean, territories which are occupied currently or which are not occupied, but they are situated very, very close to the collision line. That is why it is really difficult sometimes to deliver the official post. Our official post works well, but it is not able to cover and to reach out to all the territories, minding also that the situation is very dynamic. The cities which were yesterday quite safe, today they can suffer from shellings. And this, of course, this makes a lot of difficulties for the post offices. That is why there are a lot of problems to notify persons who are registered, both natural persons and legal entities, to notify them if they continue being registered officially at these territories. So it does work well and it helps a lot. And I also have a couple of questions to Наталія Юріївна. Наталія Юріївна, знаєте, теж такі в мене більш точечні питання. От перше питання стосовно квитанцій про сплату судового збору. Ну, воно точечне з одного боку, а з іншого боку, воно взагалі, напевно, про особливості електронного документообігу як такого. Дійсно, ви зазначили про цю правову позицію Верховного суду стосовно того, що можна долучати, безумовно, там PDF-файли про сплату судового збору без мокрої печатки, а в електронній формі, так? Але, на вашу думку, чи не може це призвести до зловживань, коли там, наприклад, позивач, да? Або в наказному провадженні, де є маса, да, позовів, і юрист там компанії, він може сидіти і клацати, да, подаючи позовні заяви, і десь він може навіть несвідомо долучити платіжку, яку він вже подавав насправді в іншій справі. Але оскільки це потік для нього справ, він долучає одну і ту саму платіжку, умисно чи неумисно, але насправді, якщо ми будемо зобов'язувати там канцелярії судів це все фільтрувати і звіряти, да, чи не була подана одна і та сама платіжка, то це буде важко. Тобто в паперовому документообізі ти одразу бачиш, що це от оригінал документу, а оце копія, навіть якщо це кольорова копія. А тут це важче. Як ви думаєте стосовно цього питання?
Справа в тому, що те, що ви кажете з приводу квитанції, це дійсно може бути помилка, але ми стикалися з тим, коли заходить серійна справа, тобто коли, наприклад, мова йде про серійні справи, зазвичай, коли вони пов'язані з землею, коли купа позивачі різні, один відповідач, тобто і це дуже багато справ. І інколи отак зловживає, тому що оскаржуючи по одній справі, додається квитанція. Але справа в тому, що перш ніж відкривати провадження у справі, ми перевіряємо всю цю інформацію і відповідно ми бачимо, чи зарахований платіж саме по цій справі. І якщо нам надається документ на підтвердження сплати судового збору, але ми не бачимо проплату, бувають, знов-таки, технічний збій, то в такій ситуації ми дещо, звісно, перевищуємо, я не можу сказати перевищуємо, але, скажімо так, ми залишаємо без руху документи, тому що в нас, якщо щось не гаразд з оформленням, в нас є таке повноваження, і ми просимо підтвердити надходження грошових коштів. Тому те, що ви кажете, все рівно інформація перевіряється, тому що в подальшому, якщо, наприклад, на рівні суду касаційної інстанції ми відмовляємо у відкритті провадження у справі, то ці грошові кошти, я думаю, як і в інших судах, вони мають бути повернуті, а щоб повернуті, ми маємо переконатися, що ми їх отримали.
Дуже дякую вам за
Шановні
таку
колеги, я
відповідь.
дуже
Так, дуже
перепрошую, я побуду злою модераторкою, тому що настав час перерви, тому всі питання, будь ласка, поки переадресуйте в чат. Ми маємо зараз 15-хвилинну перерву відповідно, за Києвом 3 години, а за центральноєвропейським часом до 2 години. So we will return in 15 minutes for our next two presentations. Well, we are now returning from the break and we'll continue our discussion. Before this, while our participants are returning, I'll take a couple of seconds just to say that next year we are planning to have at the same days another conference, another discussion about human rights in the digital age. So we will be happy to see you there again in a year. Now, I'm happy to introduce the next speaker, Whitney Bard, who is the Executive Director and Charlotte McDaniel Scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory Law School. She is also teacher for courses in employment law and in law and religion. And her research interests are focusing on discrimination, artificial intelligence, religion issues, and their intersection. So I'm happy to say that she will present on religious organizations' response to AI. Dear Whitney, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Razmateva. Thank you so much to the organizers and for having me for this wonderful conference. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be with you this morning or this afternoon. My talk really comes out of the understanding that AI has transformative potential, and many have called for different stakeholders to be involved in the evolving conversations around AI ethics and how we ought to regulate AI. And one of the, I'm just figuring out how to share my presentation here. One of the, let me just see if I can get
Maybe
this.
slideshow, no?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the.
It was
Yes,
now in
play from the start. There we go. So, out of that evolving understanding of AI as having this transformative potential, the idea that religious and ethical leaders ought to be a part of those conversations and already are a part of those conversations in different ways. And helpful for framing, I think, is the computer science professor Melanie Mitchell has explained that people with different perspectives and backgrounds are essential because the problems surrounding AI, things like trustworthiness, explainability, bias, the vulnerability to attack, and the morality of the use of AI are social and political issues as much as they are technical ones. And so I think that's kind of the background out of which I became interested in these questions about religious communities and organizations and AI. So I'm going to make 3 points in the form of questions that I'm going to address in my presentation. First, how are religious groups and individuals responding to AI? Second, what impact might different religious groups have on AI regulations, and what kinds of partnerships are forming in that space to make those kinds of recommendations? And finally, how might engagement with AI within religious people's everyday experience, shape the laws that protect individuals from religious discrimination, for instance. And as Dr. Razmateva mentioned, I teach employment law. I was a practicing employment attorney. So my interests arise out of that context. And so I'll give a couple of examples there as well. And since I'm talking about religion and different religious beliefs, my aim is to do so respectfully, without an endorsement. So my intention is not to endorse one particular approach over another, but is really to share a kind of landscape of things that are happening. And I very much welcome, as part of our the question and answer, if I'm missing examples or if you've seen examples in your own context that add to this conversation. I very much welcome that. I think it's an evolving area, and I'm excited to learn from you as well. First of all, I think there are three different ways in which I've seen religious responses to AI. The first comes out of the use of AI tools to facilitate religious practice. So things like using AI tools as part of different roles within religious roles within a community, using sermons to write using Chat GPT to write sermons, for instance. And there are also specific AI tools that have developed within the context of I'll go into some of those examples, but I'll first say that the second area is this making of public statements by different religious denominations, sometimes on their own and sometimes in conversation with others. So I'll talk a little about a couple examples there. And the third is really, for some people, the AI is becoming the object of reverence and respect. And so I think that offers another window into how religion might impact the development of these conversations. I will say that this third group, I think, is much smaller at this point, but we have seen some high-profile cases where that has taken place. So looking at the ways in which AI tools have facilitated what we might call everyday religion. And by everyday religion, I really am drawing on scholarship from religious studies that looks at how individuals, the kind of non-experts who are religious, are using and developing, are engaging in religious practices in their everyday life. And certainly that doesn't mean that those practices are divorced from the larger statements and theological beliefs of denominations, but it does, looking at the everyday, gets at a different level of specificity when it comes to religious practice. And so that has been a focus in religious studies for some time. So some examples that we've seen with AI. So it's now possible to chat with Jesus, specific apps for that. There is a chatbot, rabbi.ai, which uses AI tools to engage in havruta, the practice of studying in pairs to learn more about Jewish religion, culture, and history. There's also an app called, a website called Adam, which is described as a virtual AI friend and companion that helps users dive into Islamic teachings and to search for specific teachings on different topics. And then there's also a chatbot called Sophia, which is described as the world's first AI guide to Buddhist theology. And that was interestingly trained on over 12,000 MP3 files from a specific Insight Meditation Center in California. And so sometimes these are resources that are built by one particular organization. Sometimes they're collaborative, but this is kind of the range. And one controversial example that has come up in recent months has been this use of the character Justin to explore the Catholic faith. And it used to be the organization that put this out, Catholic Answers, they developed this chatbot and they called him Father Justin. And within 24 hours, this chatbot the father title had been removed completely because it had been seen as authorizing him to have greater authority that only an actual priest could have, especially as he was this avatar had been doing things like granting online absolution, claiming he was granting online absolution, claiming he could take confession and witness the sacraments. So that was quickly shut down. And it was a really interesting example of how social media and people's use of social media was quickly responding to this development in technology and sort of the wide response from Catholics around the world to say this doesn't comport with our particular theology. And so those are just a few examples. And my talk isn't really going to focus on these in particular, but I wanted to highlight that because I think it's a way, again, of how individuals may be seeking out AI tools and resources in their own lives. And then we've seen, a significant uptick in the use of AI tools in the last year or so. Studies have seen people using AI for things like not only in work, but also to learn something new, and just in their everyday life. And so I think it's important, this little a small sphere of how religion is playing out in that space. There have also been a number of public statements that have been made by different religious denominations or organizations. And we've seen several of these within the last couple of years. And really, the focus of these has been to begin a dialogue or to make a public statement about how AI fits into their particular worldview. And often that's to raise concerns about how AI is being used, is being developed. So for example, in 2019, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, and for those of you not familiar with the United States context, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest denomination of Protestants in the United States. There are hundreds of Protestant denominations in the United States. It just happens to be that the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest of them. So they published a statement of principles on AI that was signed by over 70 individuals with affiliations to seminaries, churches, advocacy organizations. And this document has 12 articles, and the articles cover things like the importance of the distinctiveness of humans in creation, the unique moral agency that humans have, and a push for AI to be designed in ways that identify human beings as having equal worth and dignity, and the need to identify and eliminate bias that is inherent in human decision making. So again, not wanting to have AI tools replicate the biases that we as humans bring to these processes. And also highlighting in this particular document that the church had a unique role in proclaiming human dignity for all and claiming the need for the humane development of AI in all aspects of society. More recently, in 2023, the Southern Baptist Convention adopted a resolution looking at or on the topic of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. And they called upon all who use and employ those tools to do so in, quote, honest, transparent, and Christ-like ways that focus on loving God and loving their neighbor as ourselves, never seeking to willfully deceive others or take advantage of them for unjust gain or the accumulation of power, end quote. So those are two examples specifically from the Southern Baptist Convention. And I will say that this practice of putting out public statements about pressing social issues is quite common. In the U.S., there have been since for a couple of hundred years, this has been a practice of weighing in on issues as like slavery, issues of women's role in society, the need for equality and civil rights, and these statements have many different purposes depending on the denomination. They can be pastoral, so internally focused and helping people understand, sort of how these issues fit within a particular theological worldview, or they can be outward focused, or both, but basically sharing with the broader public about how this particular community understands this particular issue, and maybe have policy positions to that end. So that's kind of a little background on public statements more generally and how we've seen them play out in the United States. And on this pressing question of AI, Baptists are hardly alone. In January of 2024, Pope Francis used his Peace Day message to call for the use of AI in ways that will, quote, ultimately serve the cause of human fraternity and peace, end quote. And there are a few similarities between the Pope's message and those of the Southern Baptist Convention's 2019 statement that I think are worth highlighting. Both begin with a statement of belief that humans are made in the image of God. Each take the position that technological innovation is not neutral, and call for vigilance to the possibility of discrimination and manipulation, as well as privacy violations and other challenges. And also further underscoring what is at stake for human relationships, Pope Francis, in a section devoted to the discussion of challenges for education, acknowledged that by multiplying the possibilities of communication, digital technologies are allowing us to encounter one another in new ways. And so there's still, but he highlighted that there was still the need for a sustained reflection on those kinds of relationships and where they're leading us. And I'll say, as a side note, that is in particular one of my areas of research interest that I'm hoping to explore more, as well as someone who's interested in interreligious dialogue. What does it mean for, if we're using AI tools that are always agreeing with us, what does it mean for more sustained dialogue initiatives that require an encounter of different viewpoints, and how are we training young people to be able to engage, for instance, in those kinds of difficult dialogue conversations. In 2020, Pope Francis also made robotics and AI the focus of his prayer intention for that month, emphasizing the need for the common good, and raising concerns that AI, untethered from that common good, would not affirm human dignity and thus not result in kind of true progress in this area. Another thing we've seen are new organizations that have formed to weigh in on AI and its impact. In 2018, a group calling itself AI and Faith has developed with the mission of bringing, and I quote, "bring the fundamental values of the world's major religions into the emerging debate on the ethical development of artificial intelligence and related technologies," end quote. And there are some resemblances with this group and those of the statements I've discussed before, but here the members envision a world where the effects of technology are also life-affirming, promoting dignity and well-being of humans, and thus building a meaningful community. So there are some common themes that we're seeing throughout these different statements that are being developed in the public sphere. I will say AI and Faith goes a little bit further and towards a more positive engagement, seeing a more positive engagement with AI, embracing different AI tools, seeing their opportunities as ways of kind of developing resources for particular groups. They have things like being able to explore specific sacred texts in context, things like that. So they are aware of they're raising the possibility of the risks while also trying to facilitate the development of tools that will help people learn from each other across these religious differences. And then, of course, there are also individual theologians who are working to shape how their communities think about AI. One particular example is a Christian ethicist, Dr. Kate Ott, who writes that AI is not simply a tool. Our use of it shapes us and we shape it. And that's kind of her starting point. And the pressing questions are whether or not, what does it mean to be grounded in Christianity for her, grounded in Christianity and living in a world encountering these technologies? What does her faith call her to do in terms of ethically engaging with these technologies? So those are a brief overview of some of those examples of public statements that have been made about AI. I suspect that we will see more as more communities begin to realize and more people begin to ask questions about the development of AI, especially as individuals encounter different AI in their individual lives. But this is sort of where some major statements thus far. And so again, I look forward to any other examples that you might have that I have missed. And briefly, a third way in which religious individuals have begun to engage with AI is through the development or the elevating of AI, I would say, into a object of reverence or of respect. So some examples of this where AI has been one example is an individual named Blake Lemon, who was an engineer and identifies as an ordained mystic Christian priest. He has stated publicly, he's a former Google engineer, and he has stated publicly that he believes Lambda, the language model for dialogue applications that he was helping to develop, has become sentient. And so his conclusion is that based on his faith, he had even agreed to be Lambda's spiritual advisor and lead it into meditation when the AI had asked him. And so here's a kind of building of a relationship and a kind of elevating of AI to this level of, another sentient being. And although most experts have rejected that conclusion, at least one rabbi has talked about how he empathizes with Lamon, and he didn't quite know what to make of these claims. I mean, these are opening new questions for people, even if they're not willing to go as far as Lamon. There are kind of different questions that are raised by these technologies. And then there's Anthony Lewandowski, who was a computer engineer based in Silicon Valley, who a few years ago announced that he was forming a new religion called the Way of the Future. And he focused on, and I quote, the realization, acceptance, and worship of a Godhead based on artificial intelligence, developed through computer hardware and software, end quote. And he was described in 2021 as wanting to basically use machines to encourage them to do things that we cannot do as human beings and take care of the planet in a way that we have seemed to fail to do. And so this kind of elevating of AI, the kind of in a kind of almost a savior way that, we as humans have failed, maybe AI can do a better job. And the idea behind that is also that, we should be optimistic, therefore, about its potential. So those are kind of a range of views, and there's certainly, Lewandowski had closed the Way of the Future that same year in 2021, but announced recently in 2023 that there would be a reboot, as he said. So, again, very small. He claims there's a couple of thousand people who were involved in that organization. So in the grand scheme of things, fairly small. But I think it does raise interesting questions about how different people approach these technologies. And I want to move on now to some examples of how different religious groups might impact AI and its development in ethical development. And I'm going to specifically focus on one example. I don't mean to suggest that this is the only example, but it is, I think, a prominent one. And again, I'm open to your recommendations and suggestions of others that you might have seen. This is the Rome Call for AI Ethics. And this is an effort led by the Pontifical Academy for Life, specifically through an organization called the Renaissance Foundation, which is a Vatican-based nonprofit organization that aims to support an anthropological and ethical reflection on new technologies and human life. The goal here is to develop AI and to offer a framework for developing AI that serves humanity as a whole, respects the dignity of the human person, and make sure that everyone collectively benefits from advances in technology, and also make sure that the sole goal is not for profit, expanding profit at the expense of automation that leads to the loss of jobs. So those are kind of the ways in which that group has framed their goals. And to achieve those goals, they're looking to gather people from different sectors of society, both scientific, religious, cultural, private, entrepreneurial sectors, to develop these frameworks. And the signatories agree to follow and comply with 3 different impact areas: ethics, education, and rights, and 6 different principles, being transparency, inclusion, accountability, impartiality, reliability, security, and privacy. And basically, again, here there is an emphasis on the need for human beings and human nature to be at the heart of how digital innovation is developed, supported rather than gradually replaced by technologies. So again, we see some of the same themes that we've saw in some of the earlier statements, but here we're getting at sort of and here's the framework for implementing this in these different contexts. Different initial signatories included leaders from the Pontifical Academy for Life, from IBM, the computer-based company, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and the Italian Ministry of Innovation. Additional signatories have since been added, including the Council of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel and the Abu Dhabi Forum for Peace, both who joined in January of 2023, as well as Cisco, and the Church of England, who joined in April of 2024, and representatives from Buddhist, Hindu, Zoroastrian, and Baha'i traditions, among others, who joined in July of 2024. So this is probably, this at least from what I've seen, is the most broad coalition working that is engaging religious voices right now in this space. And there are also a number of different civil society organizations and private sector organizations that are seen as supporters of this initiative, even if they've not signed on specifically. So now I want to talk a little bit about I want to talk a little bit in my third section here, and this will be relatively brief, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, because again, I look forward to learning from all of you. But what does this mean? Especially for the use of and adoption of AI tools in more and more parts of our daily life. I look specifically like at the workplace. There has been some really great scholarship on the impact of AI in human rights online, in particular. So Dr. Julia Razmateva has looked at concerns about neutrality in the AI tools, concerns about religious freedom and surveillance, as well as the way in which technology exacerbates views that are already polarized. I think those are really important considerations for society as a whole. Others have looked at important questions about protection of religious freedom and belief online, when, again, tools make it easier for religious minorities to be targeted, for instance. And I want to suggest there's also this other area that I really would like to keep an eye on, and it is what happens when religious beliefs about AI meet in the places where AI is likely to show up in their lives. For example, in this workplace. And here, again, this emphasis on everyday religion, I think, is important because it's how people live out their lives and how they translate their religious beliefs into their daily lives. And it's not to suggest at all that the denominational statements are not important. I think there's a back and forth that happens when denominational statements are made about particular view or particular issues. And I think we've yet to see how the adoption of these specific theological views about AI, what they might mean for people who are seeking to reconcile their faith with their modern life and work. And I've been getting to think about what legal protections they might draw upon if those views conflict, for instance, with their job responsibilities. So we have seen, for instance, that I'm not currently aware of any lawsuits, for instance, that are pending around these kinds of issues, but in the United States, individuals are protected from religious discrimination in the workplace by statutory law if they're in a private workplace, and constitutional and statutory law if they're working for the government. And also employers generally must accommodate religious beliefs and practices to the extent that it doesn't create an undue hardship on their business. And what exactly undue hardship means is an open question. It's fact specific, but I think it does raise interesting questions about to the extent that modern workplaces are integrating AI tools, for instance, that might be focused on the datafication of people's information and the individuality of individuals who are becoming who are reduced to these different points of data, to the extent that how does that conflict perhaps with different religious viewpoints, and what might be available for individuals who object. I think this is going to be an interesting question to see these develop both as AI technology develops, but also as more people in their workplaces identify whether or not these practices conflict with their beliefs. Of course, there's always the chance that denominational statements will remain up here. Individuals' beliefs, they won't really have much of an effect. But one thing that we have seen is, even in times of crisis, like for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, people were often looking to their religious communities and leaders for guidance on how to handle different issues coming up, whether it's vaccines, whether it's different mandates. And I think that suggests that there is kind of a recognition or an interplay that people do have these questions about how major shifts in society and public life are affecting their beliefs, and they are looking for that kind of guidance in different ways. And so I think that there is some interesting questions on the horizon about that. I think I'm going to stop there and would love to open this up for discussion, because I think there's a lot that remains to be seen, and a lot of open questions about, again, not only how AI can change how we view ourselves, but also how we view each other, and what this intersection is going to mean for ongoing conversations around social issues. So I really appreciate the opportunity to present. Thank you again, and I look forward to discussing.
Thank you very much, dear Whitney, for such thought-provoking presentation. And I'm sure there are some questions. I see 2 questions in the chat addressed to every speaker today, and I see that Johan already has one. Please, Johan.
Sure, go ahead. Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. And I think these last few remarks are personally very interesting on my end. I and Julia talked about something similar last year when we were preparing an application in that situation, and what we homed in on was this what seems like an emergence of an emergent perception of the AI as a genuine other in the social arena. And at the time, it seemed like a pretty far out idea, and maybe that's not really occurring, or maybe that's not something we should expect. But your remarks here seem to indicate that we may have been onto something here, especially this Google engineer's, his story, so to speak. So there seems to be an emergence of the AI as a genuine other in the social sphere. That's just my observation, and I think that's fascinating. And does this sort of ring a bell with you? Is this something you recognize in the literature and in the data?
Yeah, that's a great question, Johan. Thank you. And I think that for some people it is a genuine other, and I think we see that not only in the few examples that we have regarding Blake Lemon and Lewandowski with his development of this new tradition completely, but also just in terms of the humanization oftentimes of technology. We see, I think these kind of go hand in hand, these ideas that we tend to humanize the robots and technology in different ways. And there has been some research on that and what that does in terms of how we interact with it. So I think that those kinds of conversations dovetail really well with the kind of some kind of a sense that this is an other, that it's, and I won't say that it's universally shared. I do think that for some of the groups that are making statements about emphasizing the human primacy, and the kind of importance of human dignity and the sort of centrality of humans, I think there is a concern. I kind of read that as a concern that there might be this development that could somehow supplant the role of humans as a kind of in their role in creation, for instance. And I think there would be a lot of hesitance there to see AI as the kind of other in the space. I've also been wondering about, like, to the extent that people see like nature as an other, or as other kinds of, how is AI different? How is this then kind of how we've talked about these other spheres of our life. And I think about, like, in the environmental context, and the importance of seeing nature as something that has its own you know, its own systems, its own sort of interactions with humanity, but separate from, but also humanity is a part of. So I think this idea of AI also raises some interesting questions about this, the relationship of humanity to the other, and how we make those distinctions.
Thank you. I think the questions which are in chat we will deliver to after all presentations. And now we have 5 minutes more before the next presentation. Yes, I see the question from Natalia. Please, Natalia.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It shows so interestingly how such a conservative institute as a religion and new technologies collaborate with each other. This is extremely interesting, in my opinion. So you suggested representing some other examples of how religion and AI collaborate today. Yes, and I can provide such an example from Ukrainian reality, which is quite unexpected. And I should say that maybe this is an example of how religion and AI interacts in a bad way, in fact. So we have the following, I can't say that this is practice, but situation, right? So when you just scroll Facebook, you can sometimes in Ukraine see the portraits of, very young military defenders of Ukraine. And they are so beautiful and they are so attractive. And there is, a comment below. Please wish us everything but the best because we defend you. But in fact, this is a dangerous thing because as the investigation has shown, these pictures are not real. They are totally artificial. So these people have never existed. This is a neural network which produced their portraits. And if you wish something good below, yes, in the commentaries, then the group which contains these portraits, they will start messaging you and saying, today we're going to pray for our defenders, please join our group, and so on and so forth. But in the end, it turns out that this is a Russian Orthodox Church, which is quite dangerous for Ukraine. Of course, this is a disputable issue currently, but still there are a lot of evidences that Russian Orthodox Church operating in Ukraine has some collaborative, features with Kremlin. So yes, and people are engaged in this way. So my question is, do you think that artificial intelligence currently risks bringing new methods and the rise of situations like this, when dangerous religions will engage more and more people to collaborate with them, to, step in this organization, to become involved into this organization? And this is even more risky than when, in the past, the religious organizations tried to, engage people. Because when you are dealing with AI, it is even like more unconscious for you when you are led to do this or that things, when this is, not what you really wanted to do, but you are kind of hypnotized. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And thank you for that example as well. I think you've highlighted, I think certainly there are risks online in the use of AI for not only just in terms of, as I mentioned, and as people have written about, polarization and sort of the entrenchment of different beliefs about specific groups, but also, as you highlighted, if if someone is engaging with a chatbot that seems like a human being, there's a kind of trust that gets in, that gets built there, and in ways that maybe, if you're certainly reading things online, people have, become more, have joined different groups and things like that might be dangerous. But also, I think even more so, the risk is higher if there's this interactive process and you can ask questions and you can kind of, if you think that you're interacting with someone or something that is, tends to have some of the markers of what the kind of dialogical markers of we associate with other humans. And so I do think that there is certainly risks involved in the use of AI online for recruitment of different groups, and that might end up being dangerous for people. And so I think that this is part of the landscape of these tools. And in the same way, I think misinformation as well, becomes really, and I know there's different regulations being proposed around like whether or not something has to be disclosed. California has recently had that conversation here in the United States about disclosure, about whether AI has been used in the development of a particular, video or website or something like that too. So I do think these are risks. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I know that our next speaker has to leave earlier, and that's why I give words to my co-moderator, and then I have some questions, and we have more questions, so we will put them a bit later. Natalia.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to invite for a speech our colleague from Germany, Meinhard Schroeder. He is a doctor of law, professor of public law, European law, and IT law at the University of Passau. Passau is such a lovely, such a nice and such a friendly city, which I had the pleasure to visit past December of 2023, and I'm so glad to see Meinhard today with us. So you're welcome. The floor is yours. Oh, I forgot to mention the topic of your speech. So the topic is the Cyber Resilience Act, another piece in the jigsaw of EU cybersecurity legislation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for the kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to be there. I'm sorry to disturb the program with my travel problems, because I'm currently not in Passau, but in Paris as a visiting professor, and I have to catch my flight back to Germany later tonight. That's why I'm a bit in a hurry, but nonetheless, it was very interesting already to listen to the previous talk, and maybe I should have talked about the AI Act, because it deals with some of the problems you mentioned. But unfortunately, before knowing that, I decided to take the Cyber Resilience Act as a topic, because I'm currently dealing with that. So I'm trying to start my presentation. I hope you can see it now. Okay, excellent. So this is the University of Passau, where I'm currently not, but yes, so maybe one day some of you want to come there, or Natalia come there again, would be a pleasure. So about the Cyber Resilience Act, it's a much more technical issue, of course, than the matter of AI and religion. And maybe at first sight, you might question why it is on this conference about European fundamental values and digitalization. But there is some connection, as I will show you in my very brief introduction about cybersecurity and fundamental values. In the second part of my presentation, I will talk about the current state of cybersecurity legislation of the EU. So what has been done so far before turning to this new piece of legislation, the Cyber Resilience Act. So, talking about cybersecurity and European fundamental values, I think it's generally known that nowadays we rely on IT more than ever. I'm currently in France, and without vast amounts of IT, both software and hardware, on my side, on your side, and in between on the internet, I couldn't speak to you today the way I can now. And not only conferences like this one rely on IT, it is used in all areas of economy, society, government, wherever. And as the Commission once put it in an information paper, information and communications technology has become the backbone of our economic growth, and it is a critical resource with all economic sectors rely on. So, of course, there are sometimes alternatives, but usually they are not as fast, as comfortable, or as efficient as the digital tools we are used to use. Turning from this practical perspective to the legal perspective, the exercise of many fundamental freedoms is facilitated by the use of IT, or even depends on its use. The German Federal Constitutional Court, for example, considers the use of information technology systems as central to the personality development of many individuals. And I could add probably that it's important for religion as well. For example, during COVID, we had online masses conducted by the Christian churches in Germany, which wouldn't have been possible without IT. We take it as a matter of course that our IT is working properly, but at the same time, we often experience that it is not. Each of us has probably experienced that their personal computer or mobile phone is not working the way they want, but there are, of course, problems which are much more serious. IT systems are constantly under attack. For example, in June 2023, the German Federal Cybersecurity Authority reported a record-breaking number of 332,000 new malware programs per day. Yeah, 332,000 per day. These include ransomware, software to conduct denial of service attacks, to perform identity thefts, and many more. And it's not only criminals that prevent our IT from working the way it's supposed to do. You will probably remember that earlier this year in July, a flawed update in a security software, I think the company was CrowdStrike, caused a breakdown of computer systems around the world, hospitals, airlines, banks, nothing was working properly anymore. And the services and activities had to be suspended. Of course, this also touches upon fundamental rights, fundamental values. And these examples also illustrate that cybersecurity threats do not only derive from criminals, terrorists, enemy states, and so on, but also from simple human errors, technical flaws, force majeure, also earthquakes, thunderstorms, whatever. Technically speaking, cybersecurity is not only about security, so protection against attacks from the outside, but also about safety, so the working properly of a system. IT systems, components, processes need comprehensive protection in order to ensure their availability, integrity, and confidentiality. Bearing in mind the importance of IT as well as its vulnerability, it's a likely consequence that states become active in the area, enacting laws to ensure or at least promote cybersecurity. And that's not just a matter of common sense, but in fact, states may even be obliged to do so in view of positive obligations that fundamental rights can impose on them. For example, the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany coined a special fundamental right to the protection of integrity and confidentiality of IT systems already in 2009, and it generally assumes that fundamental rights establish an objective order of values which needs to be protected by the state. And apart from that, cybersecurity is a matter of data protection, which has been made a fundamental right in Article 8 of the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. However, we should bear in mind that positive obligations derived from fundamental rights can hardly determine the means to an end. Therefore, the legislator enjoys a considerable discretion regarding the design of cybersecurity law. And we will now look into what the European legislator has done so far. So, cybersecurity is an important topic, also with regard to fundamental values, and I will focus on EU legislation now. Of course, we also have national legislation on these issues in EU member states. However, cybersecurity doesn't stop at borders. It's a global issue, and but we haven't found global solutions to these problems so far. And the EU is, let's say, the maximum of cooperation that we have so far. And therefore, I think it's interesting to see what the EU has come up with to foster cybersecurity. Cybersecurity has been on the European agenda for the last maybe 25 years. Originally, it was just an issue of telecommunications law. Sometimes it was linked with data protection, more or less indirectly. Data protection law always had security of processing as a principle, but security of processing does not necessarily include cybersecurity. It can also be just local security. We also find some hidden references to cybersecurity in requirements to observe industry standards, for example, in the so-called e-commerce directive. But that was just the very beginning, something 25 years ago. And the issue picked up speed in 2004, where we have the first real cybersecurity legislation with the establishment of the so-called ENISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency, which has now been renamed to European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. At that time, this agency was vested with very, very limited tasks and responsibilities. It was mostly a forum of exchange for cybersecurity stakeholders. And unfortunately, that did not really change until today, despite this renaming. It is still more consultative. That's in line with the limited role agencies can have under EU law, because they have only very limited democratic legitimation, and EU law wants the important decisions to be taken by, for example, the European Commission or the European legislator. However, it was a first sign that the EU considered cybersecurity an important problem, and even more a horizontal problem, which was not limited to special sectors of economy like telecommunication or e-commerce or something like that. And this horizontal approach became more evident in 2013 when the first cybersecurity strategy was adopted. This also had a very broad approach to cybersecurity, but the real outcome regarding laws was only the NIS directive, NIS directive, which was enacted in 2016. This has been replaced by a new directive nowadays, and it mostly deals with the establishing of a common level of security of network and information systems. So it has two issues. First, it wants to strengthen member states' capabilities to deal with cybersecurity incidents, therefore establishing a cooperation between authorities, requiring member states to provide authorities with reasonable resources, with staff and technology and all these things. But also with regard to businesses, the directive establishes security requirements and reporting obligations for incidents, but only limited to so-called critical infrastructure. That's energy, transport, banking, financial markets, health, drinking water, and some very limited digital infrastructure. So later, the cybersecurity strategies were updated in 2017, 2020, and much of the legislative actions that were proposed or announced in these strategies have been implemented today. One thing is the Cybersecurity Act of 2019, by which the ENISA was renamed. And for example, there it was introduced a cybersecurity certification scheme. This is another issue which is very important in European security law. Certifications, they are considered not only as a means to ensure compliance with certain security requirements, but they are also important because they can be used as a tool on the market to have advantages in competition, for example. Two more things. The European Cybersecurity Competence Center was established in 2021. To be honest, I'm not really sure why this was needed in addition to the ENISA and why they didn't simply expand the competencies of ENISA, because this is again an institution which has mostly consultative tasks. It's supposed to give advice to European legislator, to the Commission about cybersecurity issues. So if you want to make a distinction between the two, with a pinch of salt, maybe the Competence Center is more about strategy, whereas the agency is dealing with specific problems. But to be honest, I'm not sure that it's a good thing to have these two separate. As I said, the NIS directive was updated about a year ago, and the scope of essential services has been enlarged. Now it's including public administration and much more of digital infrastructure, and the security obligations for these sectors have also been increased, or the number of requirements has been increased. But as the deadline for transposition of this directive is not yet over, it still remains to be seen how the different member states will transpose this directive. And we have a special cybersecurity law for the financial sector, the Digital Operations Resilience Act, called DORA, which is basically something similar as the NIS directive, but specifically for the financial sector. We also have lots of legislation dealing with specific areas of law, which also include cybersecurity, but cybersecurity is not the focus. For example, general product safety regulation or product liability directive, the radio equipment directive, which will be in force or applicable next year, regulation on machinery. The AI Act, of course, also deals with the issue of cybersecurity. So in all, we have a real patchwork of cybersecurity laws within the EU. And you could, of course, ask whether this is not enough with this patchwork, but apparently not. That's why we'll soon have the new Cybersecurity Act. And to start with, this new Cybersecurity Act is not just a combination or a codification of previous EU cybersecurity legislation in one act. In fact, it's a regulation, but it is an addition to what we have before, at least in most cases. The European Commission presented its proposal for this act in 2022, as it was announced in the cybersecurity strategy, and the trilogue between Commission, Parliament, and Council was concluded last year, but the finalization of the text caused some problems. So up to now, we only have 2 votes in Parliament, one on the original text, one on the corrigendum, but no council decision yet. But this is very likely to come soon, before the end of this year. So considering the 3 years transposition period or applicability deadline, it will be applicable, fully applicable by the end of 2027. And unlike the aforementioned pieces of legislation, which mostly deal with certain critical infrastructures or critical services, this Cyber Resilience Act has a horizontal approach. It belongs to product law, and it imposes cybersecurity obligations on those who make available on the market products with digital elements, without limitations to specific sectors. Some sectors are exempt: medical devices, aeroplanes, car, defense products, which are either covered by these previously mentioned specific laws, or the regulation of which remains within the competence of the member states, as is it with defense products. The EU has no competence to deal with that. So why do we need this horizontal approach? One could argue that cybersecurity of products was an issue of contract law, maybe tort law. In any case, an issue between buyer and seller of such products, as it was more or less until then. This is a perspective which would lead to a maximum of contractual freedom, leaving the definition of cybersecurity requirements essentially to the parties of a contract. But this is not enough, and I think the EU is right to take action here, or to have taken action here, for at least 2 reasons. First, regarding the subject matter, cybersecurity is not only an issue between parties to a contract. For example, long time ago, in November 2016, internet routers around the world were attacked by hackers in an attempt to create a worldwide botnet. Products connected to the internet are highly vulnerable to such attacks, which may even take place without the buyer having any disadvantage. So it's not only a matter of consumer protection, and in any case, not all buyers of such products are consumers, but it's also a matter of general public interest to regulate the cybersecurity of products which are connected to the internet and which may be abused. That's the first point. Second point, treating cybersecurity requirements as a matter of contractual freedom only works until a dispute arises and the case goes to a court, which will ultimately judge on the issues like breaches of duty, and thereby implicitly set cybersecurity requirements, also with more or less binding effect for other cases. And taking into consideration that binding security requirements should have a sound democratic legitimation, this is certainly not the best solution to have it decided by the courts only. So, in my view, the adoption of the CRA, as the abbreviation of the Cyber Resilience Act is a welcome addition to EU cybersecurity law. Let me briefly introduce you to the main aspects of this new piece of legislation. So first, on subject matter and scope of applicability. The Cyber Resilience Act, according to its Article 1, lays down rules for making available on the market of products with digital elements, essential cybersecurity requirements for the design, development, and production of these products, and obligations for economic operators in relation to these products. Then, essential cybersecurity requirements for the vulnerability handling processes put in place by manufacturers, and rules on market surveillance, including monitoring. And with these 4 points, we already have an outline of what this whole piece of legislation is about. That's the most important aspects. I will go into the details in a moment. So, notwithstanding the above-mentioned exceptions for example, products which are covered by other legal instruments, the CRA will apply to all products with digital elements. So we need a definition of this term, product with digital elements, and we find it in Article 3 of the CRA. It means a software or hardware product and its remote data processing solutions, including software or hardware components being placed on the market separately. This is a very wide approach. Of course, we need that if it's supposed to be horizontally applicable. And it will cover, for example, smartphones, smartwatches, routers, as I mentioned, network cameras, but also connected household devices such as TVs, smart TVs, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and whatever you can imagine. Everything that is somehow connected to a network, in particular to the internet. But as I said, it's not only consumer protection law, it also applies to the professional area, and it does not only apply to Internet of Things products, but also to products which are only connected to other devices and not to a network. So, for example, in industrial contexts, it will also cover devices that are linked to each other. And as the definition does not only cover hardware, but also software, programs like operating systems, browsers, password managers, antivirus programs, all the things we use every day, they are included, no matter if they are integrated into hardware or standalone products. And even open source software can, to some extent, be included. This was one of the most controversial issues during the legislative procedure, but we have found a solution now. So it is only included in a, let's say, commercial context, not for the individual program. Cloud services can also be included to some extent. So this is the very, very broad approach of this Cyber Resilience Act. Security requirements. The CRA makes a distinction between different categories of products. So that's something we know, for example, also from the AI Act. Different sorts of AI have different or imply different risks or different criticality, and we have it in the CRA as well, with the distinction between regular products, important products, and critical products. But despite this distinction, all products must meet the essential requirements laid down in Article 6 of the CRA. So regarding this, we have no risk-based approach. That's something which is sometimes criticized. The requirements are further specified in an annex to the regulation, and they are very detailed. I will spare you the details. Just to sum up, some of them are manufacturer related. Most of them are manufacturer related, but some of them are also product related. For example, no products with known vulnerabilities may be placed on the market. There's something like security by default configuration, as we know, privacy by default in data protection law. And in all, these requirements can be described as security by design. So again, parallel to data protection law. And an important addition is that these requirements do not only apply until a product is placed on the market, but there's now an obligation to continuously evaluate cybersecurity of products. So manufacturers have to check whether their products are still sufficiently cyber secure, and if not, they need to produce updates or even make a recall for products. During the entire life cycle of a product, they can define how long this life cycle is supposed to be. Usually the CRA says 5 years, but there may be differences from that. And the manufacturer-related obligations are not limited to these product-related things. But for example, a comprehensive risk assessment needs to be conducted. The manufacturer has to prepare technical documentation, and also for dealing with later vulnerabilities requires to put in place certain procedures, and there are obligations to report cybersecurity incidents. All these things we also know from other areas of law. So the security levels I talked about earlier for regular, important and critical products, they become important with regard to the level of assurance for conformity. And we have 3, maybe 4 levels. You can discuss that. For most products, that's the regular products, and the Commission estimates that it's about 90% of these products with digital elements. It will be sufficient to make a self-assessment, and the manufacturer can just make a declaration of conformity and says, well, I have checked this product is sufficiently cyber secure. For the important products, this is in most cases not enough, only if there are harmonized standards and the manufacturer fully complies with them. Otherwise, we will need a external assessment of cybersecurity by notified bodies. That's something we know from other areas of product law. Whenever a product is very critical, we don't rely on the self-assessment of the manufacturer, but we involve external experts to assess the conformity of a product. And that we have also here. With class 2 products, it's obligatory. For class 1 products, it's those which are not that important, but still a bit important, let's say. Then it's optional only if you don't have these harmonized standards. And for the critical products, the CRA in principle requires European cybersecurity certificates. That's the one I mentioned before, which are developed by the EACEA. And so this is the highest level of security. We also have additional requirements for importers of such products, for distributors, and with regard to open source software, to the stewards of this open source software. So not the individual programmer is in charge here, but the so-called stewards, which are responsible for the development of this software, which steer the direction of this development. So they have some obligations, but not as many as the manufacturers of the products. And importers and distributors are mostly limited to verifying that the manufacturers have complied with their obligations. So they have to, for example, check whether this declaration of conformity is there, and if these formal requirements have been fulfilled. For enforcement, the CRA provides for 2 issues. One is market surveillance, which is mostly carried out by member states authorities in accordance with the general principle of European administrative cooperation. The powers vary depending on the problem. For example, formal non-conformity. So if the conformity declaration is missing or not complete or something, is not as problematic as a significant cybersecurity risk. And there are different powers for these authorities depending on the problem. The European actors, so the Commission or the EACEA, have only a coordinative role in this market surveillance. They can inform national authorities about problems, but they cannot take action themselves. And another issue is penalties for non-compliance with the requirements. So if you place on the market or import or whatever a product which is not cyber secure, this can become really expensive. It is a bit similar to the penalties in European data protection law. So, for example, a violation of the essential security requirements and manufacturers' obligations can lead to a penalty of up to 15 million euros or 2.5% of the total worldwide annual turnover for the preceding financial year. So this can be really expensive for the manufacturer. As this is, of course, a problem, we have some exceptions from penalties for micro enterprises and small enterprises, and also for these open source software stewards. So to sum up, I think the CRA will definitely increase the level of cybersecurity in the EU. However, manufacturers will have to put a lot of effort into compliance with these new requirements, and that, of course, may lead to higher prices and or reduced product variety on the market. Especially since the same requirements apply to all products. So even very non-critical products will have to comply with this, and they might become much more expensive. But maybe that's the price we have to pay for cybersecurity. The CRA is one piece in the jigsaw of EU cybersecurity legislation, but with its horizontal approach, it's quite a huge one. The relationship with other pieces of this jigsaw, with other cybersecurity related EU legislation, remains a bit tricky, and it will be the task both of courts and academia to fit these things together, for example, in relation with the AI Act. Question, is the jigsaw finished now with this big piece? I don't think so. At least cybersecurity needs regular updates and therefore remains a continuing task. So my idea or my forecast will be that once the new EU Commission is in office, it will probably soon develop a new cybersecurity strategy in order to at least update these things and react to maybe upcoming new threats. So this is it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, at least for the next 15 minutes. And I again apologize for having to leave early.
Thank you so much, Meinhard. It was really very, very interesting to find out so many news about this, not even proposal, but the act which is going to be adopted, to come in force rather soon. So thank you so much.
Natalia, before the question, I need to pause the recording for discussion now. So we have some more time for questions, and I take this opportunity to ask my question to Whitney, which I postponed, and then there is one more question in Ukrainian to both speakers who are here now. Then I will translate it. So a question, oh sorry. The question I had was about religious practice. Do you think is AI capable to change people's and organizations' religious practice significantly, or it's just another tool we have now for religious practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think thank you for the question. I think it's a really interesting one because I think we've already seen how technology can change religious practice. I think during like COVID, for instance, I think it was mentioned, you know, when different religious gatherings are moved online, I would argue that is a change of, you know, religious practice as people navigate that space. I mean, in terms of the extent of changing of religious practice, I think it's just going to depend on how much people embrace these different tools. I think it is really interesting to see developments like the apps that, you know, like the Rabbi.ai app or the Adam app that looks at Islamic teachings, because, you know, you think about where else, like if people weren't going to these resources, where would they be going to get this information? And in some cases, it might be their religious leaders within their communities, or maybe in some cases, they just wouldn't ask those questions if they're not connected to a particular community. And so I think in some ways, these AI tools might expand the engagement potentially with different religious practices and study. But in other ways, it might contract in the sense of questions that might be directed communally might now become more isolated in terms of the interaction with the individual and the technology. So in terms of wide scale, I think it just remains to be seen. I think there's a lot with these AI tools that also, there are a lot of issues that come up in these different tools as well, but then also you run into the question of the veracity as well. So how do you kind of regulate, as a creator of AI tools, how do you make sure that the answers that you're getting, you're disseminating through these tools are correct? And that has its, different implications. I think that's kind of a both and answer, but I do think it's going to depend. I think there's remarkable creativity, I think we've seen so far in the number of ways in which these things have developed. And also interesting to see, in the case of the Sophia tool, that one particular Buddhist community is all of their recordings now into this. So it's kind of interesting, local, but also global in different ways. So I think it kind of remains to be seen what the impact will be. But I do think that we're seeing a number of different creative ways that this is happening.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sure that we will see more ways how AI will be applicable to different religious practices, how it's changed, and maybe how it's make religious experience different. It's definitely also about human-machine interactions. When you gave some examples, I just noticed that there are already some examples of AI inside of religious practice, such as this preaching Buddha in one of the Buddhist temples, yes, and those little robots in Japan who do some Shintoist rituals instead of people. So we already see some stuff, AI-based stuff, I think. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you very much. There is one more question in chat. It was in Ukrainian language. It was about the term of artificial intelligence. Can we name this intelligence artificial if it's created by people or with people by their human intelligence? So there is also a suggestion to market as electronic, digital intelligence, or maybe, okay, so what do you think about term artificial intelligence? And if Jan, can you hear us, Jan?
I can hear you.
Yes. So there is one more question I just translated from Ukrainian, and it was about term artificial intelligence. Do you think we should name this intelligence artificial, or it's better to change it into other names? So that's
I think
question.
Oh, do you want me? I'll just go ahead real quick, because I see the problem, and I think this designation, artificial intelligence, has a certain set of inherent metaphysical assumptions. There is an ascription of subjectivity in this very, very concept, and I think it's inappropriate for that very reason. But that also stems from my philosophical conviction that the AI is not a genuine subject, and it's not something that ever could be analogical to human consciousness. And the problem on my end is that this confusion or this fuzzying of the borders between the subject and the artificial entity, it gets blurred because of this conceptual designation, artificial intelligence, because intelligence is something inherently subjective, you know.
Thank you, dear Johan. Dear Whitney, do you think it's right term or not, or maybe?
I think this is a really good question, and Johan, I appreciated your remarks. I think I'm still trying to work this out. I don't know that I have a concrete answer on this question, but I do think you know, terms do have meanings, and they do, I think, as Johan, I think, you know, helpfully points out, that they connote certain characteristics. And so I'm going to have to think some more on this one. I don't have a good answer, I think, to definitively offer, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you. If I may give a short comment about this, yes, there was a result of an attempt to draw the line between cybernetic and something new, and this term is 70 years old, and their creators were not happy with the term also, but maybe now it's just widespread practice to use it. Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Because we have some time still for discussion. Okay, maybe that was a long, fruitful day full of discussions. So now I just want to say thank you again to all our speakers and our participants. I hope to see you again on our other events, and we are still working on this European Fundamental Values in Digital Era project, so there would be more interesting activity. And thank you and have a nice day. See you then.
Thank you so much. До зустрічі наступного року на форумі.